Roger, Andy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Agneta, for such a fabulous introduction. I mean, just an example of how some companies work. There was one company a number of years ago that used to offer umbilical stem cell therapy for various neurological diseases, started in Atlanta. Then when the authorities caught up with them there, they went to Amsterdam. When they were caught up there, they then went, I think, to Cork, and then they ended up in international waters where nobody had any jurisdiction for them. So you could be taken out to your boat to have these therapies. So it is important to be aware of that. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a very legitimate therapy, which Agneta's taken you through in the STEM-PD trial. And she's told you all about how they've been produced, what they look like, what they do in animal models. And we're now looking at Andy, who is wearing these cells in his head. There we go.
I don't want to take it off because I'll forget to take it home. So stapled onto my head.
So I thought it might be useful to begin, Andy, by just sort of perhaps giving a bit of background, explaining a little bit when your Parkinson's began, what the problems were, and then in those early years, how things sort of progressed.
Yeah, I was diagnosed in 2010. I was age 44, and that was 15 years ago or thereabouts. And so I think I've been very lucky in that I've got the typical kind of young onset tremor dominant phase, which initially I noticed my little finger would twitch, certainly in a high stress environment like this, where I used to work. And when it didn't go away when I wasn't stressed, I sort of took myself to the doctors. And first he asked me does it stop when I drink? So I went home and tested that one out, and it unfortunately didn't. So after a barrage of tests that resulted in the DAT scan confirmation of idiopathic Parkinsonism. And at that time, I was very busy at work, high-stressed IT project manager with a young family. And it wasn't as much as a shock as I think most of the Parkinson's community have, because although it's not, as far as we're aware, a genetic form of Parkinson's, my father-in-law had lived with a very similar Parkinson's for 10 years up to that point. So in a way, I'd kind of was anticipating that would be the outcome, and it was a relief in a way to know what you're dealing with. But equally, I'd seen to that point you could still live a reasonable quality of life with it. So that's why it wasn't.
So you're diagnosed age 44. It took a while to make the diagnosis, as is often the case. And then you sort of thought, well, at least I know what I've got.
Yeah,
I'm going to carry on. I have a bit of experience of it because I've seen it in the family. I mean, did you change anything in your life at that point? And did you seek anything out? So did you say, actually, I'm going to go looking for stem cell therapy clinics. I'm going to go looking for things on the internet which might help me. I mean, how did you manage your Parkinson's in those early days?
I was guided primarily by the advice of my company's doctor at the time, who said to my manager when I openly, I was very keen to let people know up front what the condition I'd got, because it's so visible when you are tremoring. I didn't want them to think it was something else. So I was very open in my approach from the start. And I understand, equally, a lot of people wouldn't want to do that if, for fear of some kind of discrimination. But my company doctor said, you've got, well, it's a research center I was coming from, so that was my background, but he said, get involved with the research early on, because there's been nothing since levodopa and DBS. That's primarily the two main treatments at that time. So he said, help the researchers along, and that's really been my mission, purpose, more to help. Having seen with my father-in-law, there are times when he was very stoic and did amazingly well, and went on for another 10 years or more after that point. But there were times when we could see there were things that he could do to help himself, or to make life easier for himself and for those caring for him and around him, that he kind of wouldn't accept. And so I was keen to understand myself, it's fantastic, the webinars, and the Michael J. Fox sort of was the main thing at the time that kind of got me into this area. And just because I think finding out about what's behind the cause, it helps take away that fear and just makes you feel a little bit more in control of it in some way. But more importantly, I've been a bit of a kind of research junkie, not technically, but just in terms of taking part in them. Because in order to get a cure, all you researchers, you've got loads of questions you need answering. And it's only the Parkinson's people and community that can help do that. So I'm preaching to the converted with you here. But it's the others to get all the patients involved in some ways for those studies that they can contribute to, in order to quickly speed up that process and get to some new treatment or therapy or understanding as quickly as we can. So in a way, that's been what's driven my kind of actions and motivation.
So, I mean, you come from a background of research and engineering and things of that nature. And so obviously, having made the diagnosis we made, you carry on working, you're getting great help from work, which doesn't always happen. And you made a very conscious decision to engage with research.
Yeah.
When you were engaging with research at that point, did you feel that you were looking for a therapy, or were you just thinking, actually, I just want to get involved with research because I'm curious to know what's going on, and something if I can contribute, that's good enough for me?
Definitely the latter. Yeah, I wasn't looking for treatments because it's all a bit scary in a way in terms of the kind of things you've been talking about there. It's amazing, really, what you've been able to achieve. But no, I was more than happy to speak control groups or just do a lot of the research is the paper-based Q&As. But it was definitely just to help. But I say just a curiosity of knowing what's going on, and just so that you can put a label on behavior. And I've got an excuse then and say, oh, it's Parkinson's, whenever I make a mistake or want something
Exactly,
to
the
play
washing
with.
up or something.
Yeah. So, but it was, I was just curious. Yeah. And that's really helpful.
And I think you joined the Trans-Euro observational study.
Correct. Yeah.
So just to explain, Agneta explained this fetal transplant study we did, which was Trans-Euro. And in order to get into the transplant arm, we recruited a larger group of people, over 100 people across various European sites, who were then followed up on a regular basis, and assessments were done. So we had this run-in period. So when we intervened, we could see what the difference was. And then ultimately, this group of patients can be compared. And that's ultimately what we'll do. So the same people who are in STEM PD were in the people in STEM PD, such as yourself, have been in the Trans-Euro observational study, as were the fetal transplants. So you joined this study, and we were obviously draining you of information every few months. And then at some point, we made the decision that we were now going to start the transplant arm. And I believe you were asked at this point whether you would like to have a fetal dopamine transplant, or at least be considered for it.
Yes, having been involved since 2012 at that time, and visiting Cambridge every 6 months, which it's great because I love to be able to say, oh, I'm just off to Addenbrooke. So it makes me feel part of the team and helping things along. A bit like the janitor for the NASA missions that's saying he's only cleaning the baskets, but he's helping the astronauts get to the moon.
We didn't ask you to do those jobs.
Damn. I find that useful because more as a proxy for myself, in terms of just things that for me to take away in terms of judging how I perform each time, if it's getting worse or not, and that degree of competition as well, just to try and get that 100% on the test that you can do, is a good challenge to have. But after a couple of years in, maybe I can remember when I was given that option as a control group, I was happy to donate my data and time for the study, but I never anticipated really being a patient, and it just wasn't the right time. It was a bit too early in terms of after my diagnosis. I felt the symptoms weren't severe enough for the kind of risk of what the procedures and we were trying to achieve at the time, with a young family and busy work. And as you say, they were very supportive and adaptive. So I carried on as part of the control group, but that hopefully allowed somebody else to take part.
And when making those decisions, I mean, I imagine individuals do it in different ways. Some people could be quite clear in their own mind, this is what's going to happen. Other people will seek guidance from the family, friends. I mean, how does it work in your household in terms of decisions?
Well, I think it was more of for that decision, I think, I can't remember, it's so long ago, but it wasn't, it was an easy decision to make. That just time just wasn't right. Whereas moving on to, still being part of that cohort and then being chosen or being given the opportunity for the STEM PD trial, I think I needed to be clear in my own mind as to what I felt I needed and why I was doing that. And before then, sort of discussing it or mentioning it to my good wife here, because I'm knowing, having say at this point, we've had 10 years of being a carer for my father-in-law, because Nicola's mom passed away at the same time I was diagnosed. So she's had so that double whammy of seeing a father decline and having a kind of husband who's going down the same path. So I was very conscious of the it's very difficult for the caring partner as well to kind of be involved. But I needed to be clear in my own mind what my motivations were, and then seek the support and views of the family.
And so now you're being offered a second opportunity for a different cell, same principle with the STEM PD, and you sort of intimated what had changed now. So you're further down, you're further along in this journey.
Yeah.
Has anything else changed in terms of making you more feel that this is more the right thing to do now rather than in the past?
Hugely. I mean, that's maybe about 8 years since the previous invitation. But by that point, I've dedicated so much to the study in terms of the data, and my time. I'm bearing in mind, in 2017, I was given medical release because the stress of the job was just not compatible with how my symptoms were. So that gave me the luxury of the time to, primarily manage just my condition for day-to-day living, but also then to take time, have luxury of time to participate in some of these studies. And I thought after 12, 13 years, to be targeted and being given that opportunity, I would have felt I was letting the study down if I was in the particular type of symptoms that you were needing to prove some of these things. So it was a heavy decision to make, but nowhere near as big as number one of 8. So I was the last of the 8 patients in the STEM PD study. So it was comforting to know already at that point they'd been transplanted and you'd got a history of what's going on. But say the people taking the early decision, my hat's off to them in terms of their braveness.
Yes, it was often the case. People would always say, "I'm very keen for that, but perhaps after somebody else."
Yeah.
So I mean, clearly you'd moved further in your journey with Parkinson's. Work is not an issue now. The family would have got a bit older.
Yeah.
And you feel that now is the time. So you're offered this. You agreed to go ahead with this. Before you had the transplant surgery, what were your biggest worries, and what was your biggest hope?
Okay, well, to answer that in reverse, my biggest hope was that I wouldn't be any worse than I would have been, say, without it. That's my only expectation from this, because it's still research. It's not, you know, proven treatment. That's what it's trying to take us to that next stage where that can be fully tested. So that was my kind of red line, as it were. And in order to gauge that, it was just the kind of evidence that you had to prove, and having that explained in documentation. You read some of the papers, and actually being explained by the clinical teams when you know, going through the screening process. You know, they explained some of the risks, well, all the risks as far as they're aware, and throughout just given the opportunity to answer questions and just clarify what, you know, anything that I needed to, we weren't sure about. So, and just knowing that you're working with, you know, basically the best people in the world at that time for, you know, going through the treatment years, it's the best possible kind of hands you could be in.
But so I mean, it's interesting because you know, one of the things we might worry about is, say, the number of drugs you need to take for the immunosuppression. There's obviously the concerns about the cells, because we don't know quite what the cells.
Yeah.
But I would say probably the biggest concern most people naturally have is around the surgery. And was that your biggest concern, or did you actually think, with my engineering sort of, you know, it's all pretty straightforward, it's just a bit of rewiring upstairs?
Well, you're absolutely spot on there. I mean, it was the surgery was my biggest fear, and maybe we hadn't watched it at the time, but we've only recently caught up with the House the documentary series on TV, and just the very second episode on the first series was my vision of how the surgery would be. I hate going to the dentist and the drills there, but when you see the patient that's you know, awake on the operating theatre, and then the surgeon's got the drill in his hand, you know, about to go into the head, that was kind of my vision of what could have happened. But thankfully, I mean, that was clearly explained wouldn't be the case, and I'm glad that the surgeon with the steadiest hand in the world and the team that support him are here today as well. But going into the surgery, all those initial concerns, I totally put at ease. I had no problems at all kind of walking into the surgery from that. And as well, I just felt, reading more about what had been done to prove it's, you know, to de-risk it as much as possible. From, again, the engineering type approach, yeah, everything had been considered. You've got fallback plans, case of adverse events, and I just felt it was the product and the whole process and protocol around it, you know, was the best I could have kind of wished for.
So you really appreciated the rationale and the evidence supporting that what we were doing, and also the reassurance that the team, that you could ask, you would be answered, there was no rush, and that you felt confident with the team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I should explain it's a bit complicated, STEM PD. Well, everything's complicated in this world, but the added complication here is that the device we use for implanting the cells is actually made in a hospital in Lund, and it can only be used in that hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So whilst the trial has involved 6 people from Sweden and 2 from the UK patients, Andy, has had to go to our colleagues in Lund and then have all the surgery and the imaging there. So it's a big enough trial, but also for the UK patients, there's well, I think it's a lovely city to go to, but I mean, but you still have to go all the way there. So you found was that an incentive?
Yeah, I have to admit it was. I love traveling, and we'd not been to that part of the world. So, and it is very pretty, and
You've been there a few times now.
yeah, a lovely, relaxed sort of way of the world, and an excellent healthcare system, you know, from what I've seen of that.
Yeah.
I think even things down to having a patient hotel, you know, 100 yards away from the you know, the main hotel. It's all, you know, really well coordinated. It's just a bit too much cabbage on the menu, I think, is about my only complaint.
But I mean, I think it also illustrates the point about how this type of work crosses boundaries. You know, in a world at the moment where boundaries are slightly being reimposed, the work like this works best when you can cross boundaries and work together as teams. And you know, we've worked on STEM PD, we worked on Transuro, we've worked for many years on this. So you've had the operation, you've come back,
Yeah.
and that now, so that would be October. So however many months ago that is, what's that? 7 months, 8 months. How's it been over that 8 month period? Has it been a smooth ride? Have you changed in the way you expected? You were expecting not to get worse, so that's a.
Well, my bar for how bad it would be is on one of the kind of pre-screening episodes, having a lumbar puncture, which I know it's a fairly common procedure. Perhaps many people here have had, and I know that's the closest they can get to the brain and what's going on until I've finished with it, and I'll allow you to then cut it open and see what's. So I've lost my track there. What was it?
It's about, I mean, I should just explain the lumbar puncture was an optional aspect of the trial. It's about how the journey's been in the 8 months since then. Has it gone as you expected? Is it easier? Has it been harder? Are there, you know, is there anything you can say about how you've, you know, been affected by this?
Yeah, the thing we hadn't really anticipated, although it was explained to us, we thought clearly at the time, but it's only when you live through it, is the immunosuppressants and steroid regime. Hadn't really appreciated and understood how that would affect me, and well, us, you know, the family then as a whole, because it really is for the first 3 months, certainly as you're on the kind of top whack dose. It became a situation. It's 3 months after, which coincided with Christmas. I was having to ask my daughter to help me cut a piece of cheese. You know, I'd lost so much strength in my upper body, and even having problems pulling sort of the clothes on. It became a real struggle. And even though I was fit and healthy, relatively at that time, you know, I think that was the biggest shock. And I mean, I was dealing with about 11 PD tablets per day, which is, you know, that's typical. And that was hard enough to manage, but that tripled up to 33 tablets at one point. You know, do a day and a different regime every day to get the right mix. So it was more of that practicalities, and then the consequence of those. I mean, wearing the hat because some of the meds, the risk of UV or, you know, skin cancer. So that's the precaution there, or you know, just avoiding certain foods and sort of some of the acid reflux reactions. I've not suffered from any of those, thankfully, so far. I've been good in that sense, but just the pure logistics of re-engineering your life around those tablets, you know, some before food, some with food, some without food. It can take you a while to get into that regime, but thankfully it's only going to be short-lived, although it seems a lot longer than 12 months. But yeah, that's not going to be far away now. So I'll be glad to kind of be off those, and because it was a bit, having been in isolation from the operation on Monday to then being released on the Friday, and then sort of jumping in a plane to come back from Copenhagen, to be immunosuppressed, but on a flight, you know, in the hindsight of COVID, and you know those kind of things. We weren't quite sure just how far to limit our life around some of those constraints.
So it was really the complexity and the side effects of the adjunct therapy you needed to take, the immunotherapy, rather than any consequences from the surgery itself. The surgery itself was
totally, yeah. That the surgery,
pretty benign.
That was a breeze. I mean, and the medicated. You know, I was really happy for that.
Yeah. And so we're sort of coming towards the end, but it would be nice to give the opportunity for people to ask some questions. I mean, at this stage, any regrets? Do you think actually you made the right decision, or do you think? And is there anything you would like to have known that has not been that we didn't say at the right time, or?
Certainly no regrets. I'm pleased to have, contributed this far, and as you've seen, it's still, I think that my biggest concern is that events like this with other Parkinson's people, it's that timeline for how long this will take to kick in. So don't expect a quick fix if, assuming it all works out, and I'm very confident it will do, on balance overall for most people. But it's, I give it after a few years for the cells to mature and fully then, regress the symptoms to some ways, although the underlying cause is still there. It's just managing that expectation in the meantime for this particular therapy. But I'm sure you're working on things, as you've already said, to kind of try and speed those up or minimize the impact. But it's a natural process that you're dealing with, and it takes 9 months to have a baby, so you can't do speed those kind of things up. But
Well, I mean, thank you very much, Andy. I mean, I think, you are a great advocate for the Parkinson's community. I think, we feel very passionate within STEM PD that the patient voice is very important, and you're a great person telling us all about this. I think it's all too easy to take the credit on the medical side or on the science side or on the surgical side, and everyone needs to be acknowledged for what they bring to it. But often I think we sometimes don't appreciate the bravery and the dedication to these studies, because it's not a long weekend, just, I'll give you a couple of hours. This is a major undertaking. And so we're very grateful to everyone who contributes to research. I'm very grateful for you today for giving this very eloquent account of your condition, how you arrived at the decision, and in these early stages, how you've approached this intervention. And I think it's very, you're an amazing man in many ways, but I think this idea that you're not going to get worse is a little unusual. A lot of people go into these trials with the expectation this is going to put me back to normal, and it's going to put me back to normal pretty quickly. And so there can be a problem in trials like this where people come in and then they come out and say, well, Roger, it's a bit of a waste of time. I'm no better now, and you sort of, well, it is only a week ago, let's give it a bit longer. So I think, your clarity of thought about how you've looked at this, the data, how you've approached it, and how it's very educational for me, and I'm sure it's very educational for everyone. So I want to thank you very much and open it now to questions for people to have of Andy or me. And Helen's got a question.
Working. It is on. It is on. I just wanted to say thank you. Wow, that was a really fantastically honest and helpful discussion. But I also wanted to ask you about your considerations around the long-term follow-up, because you've already been part of the TransEuro follow-on study.
Yeah.
And this is not a 2-year study. This is much longer than that. And whether that was part of your consideration.
Absolutely. It'd be pointless to not consider that. But the main outcome for this stage is to prove that safety and dosage and tolerability in order to move on to the next step, where hundreds of people hopefully will maybe then be able to try, and we get the rich set of data that we need to then turn it into a proper treatment that many more people can have. So that was my main concern. But equally, basically, Roger said, as long as I'm prepared to travel to Cambridge every 6 months, he'll put the kettle on and give me these barrage of tests. Yeah. I must say, the one thing just beyond that, it was the worst thing really, I think, throughout this, for me personally, has been doing the off medication parts of this. Especially just last week, I was in London for I had to have an MRI scan at 7:30 in the morning and a PET scan, say at 1 o'clock or so in the afternoon, having been off meds since the day before. And although I'm this is kind of the worst state for me in terms of showing stress, but when I'm on meds, but off meds, dreadful restless legs and twitching, and I try and keep your head still in a PET scan for 90 minutes. while your legs are twitching, and I had to be strapped down and sedated 3 or 4 times, and just that 90 minutes, that was really that and a lumbar puncture headache. It was the headache pain that was my thinking, well, if that's just for a lumbar puncture, what's it going to be like when they actually operate up there? But I say, as it happened, the surgery part of there, I wouldn't even have known they'd sort of cut my head open if for those 3 or 4 days afterwards, if I hadn't had the bandages and what have you. Well,
You did do an operation, Yelmer. Yeah. So do we have, I think Jodie has a.
Thank you. So you've answered my first question, which was about the off medication test and how challenging that is.
Yeah.
The second question I have is, they talked earlier about the phase 3 trials starting up, that they're going to be having sham surgery. So a portion of the people actually don't have the surgery at all. Would that have changed your perspective if you could have faced having nothing done and you don't know until like 2 years after you've done the surgery?
Yeah, absolutely. For me personally, because that was my biggest fear, the surgical part of it, and just the general anaesthetic risks and all those kind of things. I would, that would have really made me think a lot harder about it, and probably not go ahead if that was the option there. Because having been part of the exenatide trial a couple of years ago, and that's kind of no risk there, but this is a whole different ball game, and just the infections and being in hospitals. That's a major issue which we individually have to, I guess, deal with if that were an option.
I mean, we have very different views, I think, on this side of the Atlantic compared to the other about the necessity for this. I mean, one way to get around it doesn't get around the fact you still have to go through sham surgery, but they in some trials what they'll do is they say if you're in the sham arm, you can have the therapy then at the end, assuming you still make the criteria. But of course, as we've said, these therapies can take quite a while to work. So then there's a worry that you will actually, when the time comes for the trial to finish, you've now actually progress to a point where you can't come into it. So I think it's extremely difficult, and the question is, how much one can change the change the regulators for this. And one thing we were discussing this morning, for example, was I think it'd be quite useful in these sham operated trials to ask the individuals, the patients, whether they think they've had the therapy or not. Because I suspect when you have immunotherapy against sham immunotherapy, people if you're on immunotherapy will know they're on it. And so ultimately, if in these trials you can say, well, actually, if everybody knows what treatment they're having, even though you've got this sham surgery on, you can then go to regulators and say, well, it doesn't actually matter if we do sham surgery. Everyone predicting what they're in, so it's not a blinded study. So I think there is a very powerful patient voice that can speak to this by us collecting information in these trials about whether people think they've actually had the treatment and whether they've predicted correctly.
Is it much harder to recruit people when there's the possibility of sham versus just having the...
Well, I've never done a sham surgery. I'm not very keen on them, as you can guess. I would imagine it would be. And, say, for example, in some of the studies, what they do is so in the Blue Rock phase 3 study, it's 2 to 1 in. So you've got a 2 in 3 chance of actually having a transplant, but you still have a 1 in 3 chance of not. So they do change. So it's not necessarily 1 to 1. But I think there will be a lot of people who won't necessarily sign up for it. The other problem you have is that you can probably unblind yourself quite easily. I mean, you can get private blood tests, you can get scans. So trying to protect the data that can get collected outside of the trial so that you can't unblind yourself is quite a challenge, especially in this day when we have electronic health records, as many places do. So, yes, Gillian, are there?
We heard very clearly from Andy how he chose you. How did you choose Andy? Because you've got almost godlike capabilities. I'm much more optimistic than Andy. I think he'll be cured and he'll be fine. And you'll give him back his life.
Yeah.
Which makes you into a god.
Well,
how did you choose him?
Well, he set up a bank account for me.
Excellent.
So it's a good question. How do we choose people? So essentially, you obviously set up inclusion exclusion criteria for your trial, and then essentially anyone can join up to a certain number. And I would say for these type of trials that we're doing, obviously, if you fit the criteria, then you could be, then you have the potential to be recruited. We're also, because of the intensity of what needs to be done, we like people to live locally because it is quite a lot of monitoring. But you know, the way we did this trial was that people signed up for TransEuro. We followed them, and if when we were starting STEM-PD, if people were in the right inclusion criteria, we would approach them. So there's nothing, you know. So it depends on people coming to us, and then in some ways people sticking with us, and then everybody's open to it. And you know, in TransEuro, Andy was not alone in saying he didn't want it. We had quite a significant number of people who said they did not wish to proceed. So quite happy to join the observational study. Might have a transplant, but when it comes to it, thank you very much. I'll wait.
But it's
One
good
more.
as well from the patient perspective. You're always given the option to drop out at any time without any reason. Again, having that as a fallback was another reason to kind of carry on until if that became an issue. So that's an important consideration.
I think we're going to pick up the conversation after a short break, but thank you both very, very much indeed. That was the most fantastic discussion. I think we need to have a huge round of applause.